Welcome to InnerSight, Health Optimization with Rudy and Sean.
Okay, here we go. We into our new podcast. Our podcast season was a bit slow in June, so we replayed one of our previous episodes, and we brought in the VO2 Master. Pardon the pun. In today to chat about. People think about the VO2 as the top of what you're doing, but I think, Hannes, we're going to talk today about why we need a VO2 test and why it's not only for sports people.
I think that's quite important. I think a lot of people think it's only athletes that needs a VO2 number, and they think of VO2 max as a single number, but we can get much more than a single number from testing the VO2 max with the VO2 Master. So we use the VO2 Master, and people that don't know, we use Hannes to come into our clinic and do the tests for us if we need a test to be done. Thanks for joining us again.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Yeah,
Hannes, you mostly concentrate on runners and on cyclists. So maybe for our listeners out there, just a broad paintbrush. What is a VO2 test? What does it look like? Just again, so people because the Tour de France just finished, and now it's like, oh, these guys have got these high VO2 maxes, but I mean, for the layman out there, what do you do? How do you test it? And what number do you get? Like, do you get a 20, a 30? Where does it lie? Maybe just for our listeners, just not having had a test before, what would you do?
Yeah, so the VO2 test is basically a fitness test. The main thing that is tested is what we call VO2 max, which basically is, you can see it as a measurement of, you can almost say, your engine size, but it's how effective the maximum amount of oxygen that you can use when you do something like training. You use oxygen for fuel, for anything, just as we're sitting here as well. But VO2 max is the maximum amount of oxygen you can use. See it is like a water pipe, the most amount of oxygen that you can get to your muscles when you use it. So obviously when you are training at very high intensities, then you need the most, as much oxygen as you can get. High VO2 max means you can get more of it to the muscles to use for energy for them to do their job. So what VO2 max is basically then the let's say the amount of the liters of oxygen per minute per body weight that you that's the metric that we measure. Now, why per body weight is then what you're trying to do is someone that weighs 50 kilograms, someone that weighs 100 kilograms needs to move 1 kilometer. So the oxygen demands for the two different classes might differ. So the absolute oxygen volume that is needed is going to differ. So a better way of measuring this metric to predict or to determine fitness is to standardize it per kilogram body weight, and then it makes sense because a smaller person might have a smaller VO2, absolute VO2, but per kilogram they might actually be able to, it tests a little bit better.
And that's also where, people know VO2 max is a number like 45, but the 45 actually means 45 milliliters per kilogram of body weight that they'll able to use per minute.
Yeah, per minute. So that's the metric. And how we measure that is we do exercise test. Well, either what we do is numerous ways of doing it, but the two main ones is either a cycle test or a walk/running test, where we start off at a very low intensity and increase the intensity gradually up until almost, let's say, your max until you can't go anymore. And while you're doing this, we measure your oxygen consumption. We do this by wearing a mask, a device like that. In these days, we have more commercial devices available. Like I use the VO2 Master. You've got the more fancy lab equipment that you have in some of the bigger facilities. But basically, what you do is the mask measures a couple of things. The main thing for this part of the conversation is the oxygen consumption and how that changes as you increase, and we see where does that plateau out, and that, or where does the increase as your intensity of the test increases, where does it start flattening out, and then we know that's the maximum amount of oxygen that you can per minute get to the muscles and for metabolism.
And I think the beauty of this test is then that it actually tests more than one system. It tests on the one hand the lungs, getting the oxygen in, then the heart and the pipes getting the oxygen in the blood to the end organ, which is the muscle. So it tests all three of them together in a certain way to give you the numbers for fitness.
Yeah, that's basically why I like the water pipe analogy. It's like, so how wide is the pipe to get the oxygen to the muscles? Yeah, or to the muscle where it is ready to be metabolized. So,
but the pipe starts at your mouth. So we're using that whole pipe till it gets to the muscle.
So it's a whole system testing.
Yeah. So how basically a couple of bottlenecks that increase how efficiently can you get the air into your lungs, from lungs to the blood, and get via the blood, via the heart to the muscle, get it into the muscle, and do the muscle cells have the is it ready then to use the oxygen? Then that's basically the chain. So if there is a weakness or a poor VO2 number, the question arises, okay, but what's the limiting factor? And this is where the devil starts getting into the devil's in the detail. Yeah.
So the highest number is only as good as the weakest link in the system.
That's, I think, a good way to see it. Yeah. So I do think there's a certain components of this chain has larger effects. Like, for example, it was long time believed that lungs has a big influence, but it seems like with weaker VO2 max numbers, it's less likely the lungs, but more likely from oxygen transport via the blood or at the muscle level. Yeah. So yeah, but I think for general purposes, yeah. So we want to see what is the number and does it need to increase or decrease, and that's, I think, what we measure here. I think so you can go into more detail, but I think for using that as a tool to see as a metric for health and fitness and training specificity, the knowing what the number is and how to move it is the primary focus point.
And I think you mentioned now the reason for testing for health and fitness and all these things. And maybe this is a good point where we can just quickly say why we're interested in the number from a longevity point, and why we do VO2 max testing in the clinic and what information we can get from that. So it's still the best predictor of all-cause mortality, better than cardiovascular risk or any other of the calculators. I think that it is astonishing that if you go look at the data, the all-cause mortality, if you move from the unfit person to the elite athlete, there's a 5-fold decrease in mortality. That's massive. We don't see it in anything else. So, and that's just, you've explained what we test, and that tells you that it's a test of the whole person, the whole body, all the systems together, and why elite athlete has just got so much less mortality than an unfit person in that sense. The other thing that we also do is we test VO2 max because we're very interested in what would it be in future. So when we talk about VO2 max, we would like to know what it would be like when you're 80 or at a certain age, because there's certain things that you need to be able to do when you're older. And there's a more or less a cutoff of about 15 to 18, depending on what literature you use, where independent living becomes a problem. Okay, so we can calculate, because VO2 max fall naturally over time, about 10% per decade. We can say that, okay, if your VO2 max now is at a certain value, say 45-ish at 50, then it would be probably about 30, 32 at age 80, more or less. So we can estimate what it would be. And if you're close to that 18 value, we know you're going to have a problem in the future. And that's why we get people in like you to test and then suggest, how can we improve these numbers? What do we need to do to improve the numbers that we don't end up with a VO2 max of 20 at the age of 80?
Yeah.
So Hannes, I just want to ask you, so where do you see unfit, fit, super fit in these numbers, or is it thumbsuck, or how do you work out which guy is unfit? Is there a number that's unfit, or?
Yeah, that number differs from age group and differs between males and females as well. So we usually compare it to some data over numerous years from large studies to get an idea of where these populations are. So, for example, in your 30s for a young male is very low, but that might actually be quite good for, or not reasonably good for like older female type of thing. So it is very age dependent. So yeah, so we compare it usually in these age groups. And we just to give I think it's more like a visual cue for us also to see, okay, this is a low number. This is something we need to work on, but also give context to the person as well. So this is where you sit in your peer group, and this and
so VO2 max is corrected for weight, but not for gender.
It is. Well, the data has normative data from different studies that says between gender. So a 40-year-old male's excellent requirement would be, for example, about 50 milliliters. But for female, about 45, for example, would be the same percentile in their age group. So yeah. So yes. Gender plays a part, age plays a part. Yeah.
Age, gender, and your so you compare to your peers basically and say if it's good or not.
Yeah. So that's basically how we compare it. Compare it. Yeah.
Okay. So 20 for 80-year-old might still be what's the word I'm looking for? Almost satisfactory, but for a 25-year-old male, it is it's really
problems,
bad.
Problems,
okay, that's an unfit person. Okay, I want to pull back again, and I want to say practically. So the person sitting listening there, okay, I want to know my VO2 max. So practically, they go onto the website, they book with you, and then they need to pick. Okay, I'm going to cycle, or I'm going to run, or walk, or I mean, you have to be able to do one of those two things to be tested. Am I right?
Yeah. So we usually try and we suggest do if it is someone that's already an active person and they're interested in VO2 max and the metrics that goes with that. We'll get into that now, but I say do the sport that do the modality that you are accustomed to. Because with the test that increases in intensity, we want to get you close to almost, I would say, failure, where you can't continue anymore. So if you are a cyclist but you haven't run for a few years, your legs are going to fatigue before we reach that point. So we rather do the cycling test better. So it can have an influence because the limiting factor might not be that your fitness, you've reached the max of your fitness, but the fatigue in your legs have set in because you're not conditioned in that as well. Someone that is completely unfit, that is that hasn't done any of the two of the modalities we do, we say the cycling is less low impact. But we do get cases they say, I haven't been on a bicycle for years, my quad's going to burn just looking at it. So then we have walking protocols on the treadmill that is also very effective in getting to a VO2 max. The downside of these walking protocols, you won't get that accurate threshold numbers, which we will explain now, but because the increases is a little bit larger jumps, and we don't only use speed but also incline to change it. So it's more of an indication of then for that person we're interested in where the VO2 max is, and that's the thing about measuring VO2 max. The value of it, I think, getting it tested, there's more value to the person that is inactive or has low fitness to getting that as well, because we know with a lower VO2 max, the capacity to improve it is much better than someone that is extremely fit, where there's a bit of a diminishing returns. The fitter you get, the less percentage points you can improve your VO2 max, which and then we are actually more interested in what is the VO2 max and how, so that we can have a baseline and see how much we do need to improve it and how we can improve it. Where with the elite or the really fit runner or cyclist, we are interested in where is the VO2 max, but we're more interested in the metrics that come with it. Where's your threshold in comparison to your VO2 max? How efficiently are you working at VO2 max, or what power do you need to put out, or what pace do you need to run at VO2 max? These numbers are performance, can have like a performance I would say prediction value, or give some insights in performance. So then the VO2 max is the less important one, not important, but less important metric. But what do you need to do to get there for the elite one? And that tells you where you are in terms of your fitness. So
that's it, if I understand correctly. So you've got two athletes, and say both the VO2 maxes is like 60. The one might be doing it at 300 watts, and the other one might be doing it at 250 watts.
Yes.
And that's the difference between the two then.
Yeah. So that the watts at VO2 max would then be, in this case, a better predictor of performance if the two is going to race against each other. Yeah. Look, and then you have to go down into the details and see, okay, why is it? How do we improve it, and why is that difference there? Why does he's got to? So that's a good thing. Both of them have very big. The water pipe is very big. You can get a lot of oxygen, but the one is just able to produce a lot more power out of it than the other one. The question becomes then why, and that's a different avenue that we go off as well.
But I think, a lot of people think that VO2 max, and certainly there's some truth in it, is genetically determined. But the good news is that if you're unfit, you can improve that number.
Yeah. Yeah, I think if I understand correctly, the genetics determines the ceiling of how far it can improve. I mean, we all can't have 90, score 90 on the VO2 max, but but it does seem, like I said, it does. There is if it is quite low, the capacity to increase it is much. There's a lot more room for improvement, or capacity to improve it, than someone that's already scoring in the 99th percentile. So for that person to improve it, it's going to have to work really hard to improve it by 2%. Where the person that's really unfit has to start a moderate degree of exercise to, over a couple of months, improve it by, let's say, 10 or 15%. Yeah. So
and the other thing also, as I said earlier, is that the VO2 max naturally decline about 10% per decade. But if you do exercise, you bring that number down to something like 5 to 7%, which gives you that buffer later in life to keep it a little bit higher for longer.
No, exactly. Yeah.
And then if you delve down, so now you get a number. Obviously, you always send us the reports, but the VO2 max is the big number that you get. Like, let's say you've got a 48. But for the unfit person, let's say they get a 36. That is actually not the best number. It's a great number to have, but then you want to delve down for the information you will give that person how to get fit, and that's where the zones come in. I mean,
the thresholds.
Yeah. So, and how in your report, what does that mean for the layman out there? What will you hear, or what will they hear from you with that zones?
Yeah, so the zones, I think we've spoken of it before. I don't know if it was with me, but the zones that people talk about is the most popular one is the 5-zone model, where it's just a way of classifying the intensity at which you can work. So zone 1 being low, zone 5 being very high. So VO2 max is going to be in zone 5, where that's at your peak. You can only sustain it for a couple of seconds, maybe a minute or two, so and so forth. Zone 1 is very, very low. So the three of us, our muscles and our cardiovascular system is stressed at zone 1. Now, certain things happen as the your intensity of exercise increases. So with running, or let's go with running. So if you start walking, you started walking at a slow pace, you started at a low intensity, and the energy demands from the muscles are quite low. As you pick up the pace and you start jogging and it becomes a sprint, the demands of the muscles increases. Now so what happens then to feel this, basically the zones that gives us an idea of where the energy is coming from. And a training zone model was designed to tell people, if you want to develop a certain fitness, how can I say, pathway, you have to train at this intensity for this duration of time. Then you stimulate that fitness pathway. But if you want to do the higher end one, then you have to train at zone 4 to stimulate that one. Now, these two pathways, you can break it down, and this is what we measure. These are the thresholds that we measure. So I like the analogy here as seeing it as two factories that produce energy for the muscles to function. So in the old days, they used to talk about aerobic and anaerobic energy. This is a very oversimplified analogy that I use, but it works for this purpose. As we're sitting at here, so the two factories are basically, the one is a factory that uses oxygen with fat and carbohydrates to produce energy. Now, and the other factory uses carbohydrates for energy. Now, the one that uses oxygen and fat and energy is basically a factory that's built at let's say a mine. It's got a really, really big supply of raw materials to produce. But getting oxygen from the air to the muscle is a slow process. So it's only got one production line. So it produces energy at a slow rate, but it can just go for a long time because the raw materials are quite high. Now, as we're sitting here, the muscles are using that. As the intensity increases, and so the oxygen gets processed with either fat with fat and carbohydrates. It prefers fat because it's a better fuel source.
You get more ATP from the fat than from the glucose.
Yeah, but it's a slow process. Yes. So as the demand starts increasing, as you start speeding up, that fat and oxygen starts increasing, but it reaches a certain limit. It can't the rate can't keep up to the demand. Then that factory starts using carbohydrates as well, and that's where you start seeing build up in something like a little bit of lactate going into the muscle. So that point right over there, that's what we call your first aerobic threshold. It's basically a marker where your body starts needing to supplement that oxygen and fat area.
Sorry. Before that, to even dumb it down a little bit more, is where we mainly burn fat.
Yeah. So at that low intensity,
so,
you can stay
so if you want to stay in that fat burning zone, that's the area that you're working in.
Yeah.
And then you cross that threshold, and then you need to get the other suppliers in and use glucose more. Yeah. There's always a little bit of glucose, but I mean, then that demand is just you've exceeded that.
Exceeded that. So it starts building up. So that marker usually is what they say about. So if you want to train that aerobic long intensity system or upgrade that factory, I would say you have to spend a lot of time that. And the zone model helps us with that. Say, okay, you have to stay in zone 2 to stress it enough, but not too much that you stress it enough for a long period of time. That's what you want to get it to improve.
And for the uninitiated or the unfit athlete, that's quite important, because what we're aiming for here is the problem with how a lot of people train is they train too little in the lower zones, and they train too hard in the higher zones. So we want them to train more in these lower zones that you now can give them, because it might be lower than they actually think. But with getting fitter, that zone will move and can move.
Yeah. So
that switching point, you can do it with the VO2 Master. We can test and see where that happens. You can do it with lactate testing as well.
Yeah.
And that correlates more or less with the zone 2, end of zone 2, which you can put a heart rate number to then. So you've got a value that you can use. Okay, for myself, because it will differ between me and you and really, there's a certain number at which more or less where I will switch to the other fuel sources.
Yeah, so that marks the intensity at which these fuel sources start changing. And lactate testing and the oxygen testing is basically two different lenses looking at the same process. So what changes, so how we measure it with something like oxygen sensor is the changes in breathing rate, which is associated with an increase of CO2 in the muscle. But at the same time, there's an increase in lactate in the muscle. So you see the one device is measuring the one end product of the same process, where the other one just looks at the other one. So this first threshold is where there's a bit of an accumulation of these byproducts, which are byproducts of glucose metabolism, and this is where the other one switches in.
So sorry to intervene, but you can also do this with a calculation of the heart rate, workout, and a percentage of that. But this is obviously a much better way of doing it than the old calculation of 220 minus your age and then work out the percentage of the zone.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So the calculations are like the estimates of where it should be based on data of where.
But this is now actually tested, so now you know for sure, and it's not a guessing game.
Yeah, for the individual. Yeah. So now we're interested in so that's the first threshold that you hit. Okay. Now we're interested in where that sits, because that's going to determine if someone tells you need to do aerobic training, then we know, okay, if you reach this intensity, and then that's where you need to train. These intensities are marked for a person that tries to train by either heart rate, speed if you're a runner, power if you are a cyclist. Then we know if I train at if I run at a pace of 630 minutes per kilometer, and my heart rate is 145, then I know, okay, I'm at the right intensity to develop this factory and get it bigger and better. Now that's zone 2. Then you start increasing and the carbohydrates metabolism starts increasing, and these byproducts that we're measuring and getting through into blood is increasing as well. Breathing rates change, lactate change. At one point, that system of oxygen metabolism with these both oxygen and even glucose can't keep up with the demand anymore. Now the other factory starts kicking in. So this factory still runs, but you have to start getting more, topping it up because the intensity is getting really big. And this is where the other one kicks in. This is a system that doesn't use oxygen. You metabolize carbohydrates, but the byproducts are quite a lot. Then you start seeing spikes. Spikes in, like if you do the blood lactates, the byproducts start jumping up because the demand for the muscle exceeds the rate of production from the two systems that are already running, and then you get a top-up system. And then this is what we call your zone 4, or your lactate threshold, or your anaerobic threshold, or your FTP, or something like that, because now it's not that pace across that line is not sustainable for long periods of time, because the byproducts from this process starts building up, and that kicks, and that byproduct sets fatigue in to a certain degree. Carbohydrates in the muscle, the glycogen still starts depleting a bit, so you can only maintain it for a few seconds. Now, why that lactate threshold is so popular is because that's the number for if you interested in running a certain race at a certain pace. You don't want to hit a wall before you've reached the end, because hitting a wall is, very, very simply put, is if you exceed that line, you start byproducts start accumulating, fatigue kicks in, then your body has to force you back to a level where you're mainly using, for example, using fat metabolism, because that hasn't depleted, or that's what you can sustain, and that means you need to start walking because you're running.
That's the bonk.
That's exactly, yeah. So that's basically it. So we're interested in that. That's why the lactate threshold is quite popular for people that are training, because then if you want to train a certain amount of time, or you want to, there's certain performance like with cycling or running, that's a good value to know where that is. And we mark that again, either with power, pace, or heart rate. So I know if I want to train that number, I need to do, for example, tempo runs or intervals at that threshold. Then I know I have to train at a heart rate of 160 for, and then there's,
And is that fixed, or that can also be trained?
So that moves as well. So
both of the points, VT1 and 2.
And that's what the training basically is. So yeah, so if you cross that, then you're in zone 5, it's the high intensity, and then you reach VO2 max. But reaching VO2 max, just for interest sake, it doesn't mean you can't do more. You can go a little bit more. It's just the maximum that you've reached the limit of oxygen you can get. So you're going to fatigue in a couple of seconds because everything of it just needs to come from this one, this other factory. So what we're interested in is, so when we do a test, we determine also where are these 2 points. And that's why we start with at a very low intensity and gradually increase it up to see where these 2 points kick in, these 2 thresholds. Now, if we have these 2 points, then we can go put this in a nice little table, which is your 5 zones, and say, right, zone 2, this is happening. Zone 4, this is zone 4 and 5, this is happening. Now, from a performance perspective, those 2 numbers, shifting that numbers up is a good training strategy, because if your threshold, that higher intensity threshold, can kick in, instead of kicking it at a pace of 5:30 minutes a K, it rather kicks in at 5 minutes a K, then now you can run a half marathon at a faster pace for a longer time before you go into the red and start hitting that fatigue that we talked about now. Or if you're doing an ultra marathon, then we know you want to you have a long day ahead of you, you need to run comrades for 10 hours. Now we want that aerobic threshold, that those stay in zone 2 as long as possible, not to let fatigue set in too early. So a lot of our training needs to be there. But that's low intensity. That's why the zone 2 training is a lot longer than zone 4 intensity, because you have to spend a lot of time there to get a stimulus. So if you can do your comrades training at a 6 minutes a K pace instead of a 6:30 minutes a K pace, now you can see there's a good chance your time for an ultramarathon is going to get better. So this is how it improves. Now, what is improvement is we're interested in what heart rate it is. And a lot of times that doesn't change. It's like at 160 beats per minute, you hit your threshold. But what's happening now is with the retest, when we test it after a couple of months again, we see, okay, last time it was at, let's say, 280 watts. But now it's actually now moved above 300 or something like that. So now we know, okay, you can actually, if you're doing a certain race distance where a smart race strategy is to stay as close to that threshold as possible, now you can actually push a little bit harder and you can decrease and that means your time is going to improve. So so your training is structured more around that. And getting back to our where we started the conversation is what VO2 max means for unfit people and fit people. For a fit person coming in here, we were interested in what your VO2 max is at this stage. But if you're really fit and already well conditioned for a couple of years, that number is quite high, and getting more like a 2% improvement is going to be quite hard work. But the question then is it important for what you're trying to achieve? Then we're actually more important, like, where are your thresholds in relation to VO2 max, and what speed are you running at the moment to get to VO2 max? And that's more of a proxy of your current state of your conditioning. And if you look at these numbers in that context, if that makes sense.
It's very interesting, because also that first system up to that first turning point is that's absolutely looking at your insulin sensitivity, the way you are able to metabolize fat and use it for energy. And we often see it in diabetics. You can do a lactate test at rest and you'll see it will be high because they're already using carbohydrates at the resting pace. So to improve your insulin sensitivity, that's also the zone that you want to spend your time on and make sure you get that system going, improve that system, improve the mitochondrial density and numbers to actually use fat better.
Yeah.
So it's not just an exercise thing, not just for athletes, but also for health reasons.
And we see a lot of times like that lower zone training as well. You can be very well developed at the higher end side, but that lower end doesn't mean if you're very efficient at the higher end of that fitness spectrum, it doesn't mean the lower end is set in stone. It is there, because it just means like those pathways that are dominant that side are well developed, but maybe this bottom one, like the mitochondria or the density of capillaries and the ability to carry oxygen or metabolize that can still improve. So what we see, or the other point I wanted to make is, running is a good example. So if you want to start running and you've decided you're only going to run 1 kilometer, and then in the next week you're going to run 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers, it's not as good of a strategy than instead doing 5 kilometers, but starting walking 5 kilometers, then walking 5, but walk 4, run 1 minute, walk 4, run 1 minute. Because if you're not conditioned to something like running, and this is quite unique to running because it's quite high demand on the legs. Your legs take a lot of impact in it, and if you're not conditioned for that, running is a high intensity activity. So from the first step, the demand outpaces what your current low intensity factory can produce. So now you decide you're just going to run a short distance, but actually what is happening, you're mostly developing this higher end because you're doing a high intensity activity for you. Your neighbor who's a well-developed runner actually says, no, this is actually quite easy. But for you in this case, and this is why the numbers are important. For you in this case, it's a high-intensity activity. So you're doing high-intensity training. So then it's actually better to bring the intensity down to develop that base first. And like you said, the same, all the physiological changes that needs to happen on that aerobic level.
Yeah. And unfortunately, that system takes time to develop. So a lot of the programs, I think the 80-20 rule in many instances is still true. But lately in the media and social media, everyone has gone on, but it's a waste of time. If you only have so much time, you should only spend it in this. I think the long and the short is both systems will give you a benefit. I think both systems will over time increase the VO2 max. It depends on what you're trying to achieve. And that's where, from a health perspective, we still feel the zone 2 is still very important for developing that metabolic side of the equation. That's a common conversation. Is, well, I've only got 2-3 hours a week to exercise. How are we going to split it between the zones and things like that?
A good thing to remember, I think it's very important to say, is it's not either or. It's a spectrum. It's a spectrum as well. So the body is not like, it's not a switch. One switch goes off and the other one goes on. So this is why if you're doing not doing something, you only say this is a good point that you make. Is if you only have a set number of hours, something is better than nothing. So if you are at least doing something, then that is better than doing nothing as well. And I think a big misconception, and I think this is some of the conversations, the debates on zone 2, where people get it wrong, is zone 2 doesn't mean really easy. You're working, but if you do it for long enough, you should be tired enough that you can't do it the next day. That's good zone 2 training, or should do it at that same intensity. You need the form of recovery. It's not, because then our neck muscles are working now in zone 1, so or below that threshold. So we should be getting aerobic stimulus, or just walking should be enough to develop the muscles for running, for example, because the intensity is low enough. Obviously, there's no biomechanical conditioning and other factors that plays a part there, but you have to. Zone 2 is also a stimulus. You need enough of the stimulus to get an adaptation. It's like bicep curls. You can do bicep curls with a weight that you can manage 20 repetitions. You're not really getting fatigued. Maybe feel it a little bit. Your biceps aren't getting it stronger. You actually have to stress it to get an adaptation. And for that system to improve, you also need to stress it. So improving that zone 2, all the fitness elements that goes in zone 2, you need to be stressed in zone 2, and the best way to do that is volume. So a long run or a long ride at zone 2 must be hard, but not because it's intense, because it's long at that limit of the zone 2. So that's why you hear cases of like There was one study that came out now. I can't reference it accurately, but they said, but actually zone 3 training actually has a benefit into mitochondrial density. So you can, the argument was made, you can do less but higher intensity that does develop those zone 2, which shows, I think the results showed that you can have that adaptations because you're still stressed. It's not an either or, the system's working. But I think the argument against that was, are you doing it long enough for the other adaptations that goes with that to mark that? So it's, again, a specificity thing. This is why HIIT training became popular for people that don't have a lot of time, because there is some form of this, even though it's at a high intensity, you do get a little bit of the lower end as well, because, and this is why it's important to see it is a spectrum. But to really develop that and you have more time available, then it is a good idea to spend a lot of time there. Yeah.
I want to backtrack a little bit again. Okay, so I think we think most people should have an idea about where their VO2 max is. More testing is necessary. So let's say one of the clients book on the website. They book, this is the time. They're going to then decide, okay, cycling or running. Do they need to eat something? Do they need to? So let's say they're going to run. They bring their running shoes and some comfortable clothes. Do they get a letter to say this is what's going to be done, or how does that process work?
Yeah, so you book a session, and then with all the instructions that you need for the day, don't eat too big 2 to 3 hours beforehand. Try not to drink coffee before, and also not a big training session the day before. You need to be as fresh as possible. It is you are going to work hard, but then on the day that you arrive, we have a nice introduction, a chat, make sure if there's any, it's safe as well, and no injuries or anything like that. And then we start off with a bit of a warm up. You have a heart rate belt that we put on. You warm up a little bit either on the bike or on the treadmill, starting at the first stage's speed or pace or intensity. You do that for a couple of minutes. Then we fit you with the mask that does all these measurements that we do. It's a mask that you wear in your face. It doesn't restrict your breathing at all. It's just really weird having this thing on your face, but that's basically it. And that's going to measure your breathing rate, your oxygen, and all those type of things. And then we continue the warm up for another couple of minutes just for you to get comfortable with that. And then we start every minute we start increasing the intensity on the bike by setting the watts, or the speed on the treadmill by very small increases for 1 minute. And we build it up, and we started too easy. Most people start with a walk with the treadmill test, and it ends at like quite a really a nice uncomfortable run at the end. Usually what we do is, how we determine how to stop the test then is where we used I look at a couple of things. We look at, does the heart rate start getting close to the predicted heart rate max? Does the VO2 number start plateauing or close to plateauing? But more importantly, I ask you, how intense does it feel out of 10? Usually I tell people, just point with your fingers. We use a scale called the rate of perceived exertion. It's basically where you rate how hard you work out of 10. And we say we're going to start very slow, very easy, but I'm going to usually tell people, especially the first time you're doing it, and I say we at least need to get to like a 9 out of 10, and then we stop it there. The more experienced people that have done it before, will try and say, when you hit the 10, we try and get to 10 out of 10, and then we stop and do a 3 to 5 minute recovery, where we measure how these numbers come down to measure recovery efficiency as well. That also gives us a bit more information on your fitness and those type of metrics. And afterwards, then we have a quick look at the numbers, but the reports that we try and generate, we just spend a little bit of time just crunching the numbers to get more value out of it. Yeah, that's a good rundown of how the assessment works.
I like how you say nice hard run.
Yeah, it's
Nice
maybe
hard run.
underplaying that a bit. Yeah, so,
Pretty whacked afterwards.
yeah, no, it's a workout. It
It's
is
a
a workout.
workout.
So, but I mean, it's for someone that is unfit and finds this intimidating. I won't push them to that number as well. What we do with the first test is, in those cases, alternative is we can do a submaximal test where we at least get to 85% of intensity or heart rate. And then to get those thresholds for the unfit person as well, but get the VO2 reading close to fatigue, so that we can a little bit more accurately derive it from there. Or for future use, if it is a baseline test, the first test, then we say this was the speed that you reached or the watts that you reached, and this was the VO2 number at this. Next time we test you, if you can go to maximum, we're going to see, okay, this is your maximum, but you're going to compare it again at that watts and see what is your VO2 now, and did it actually improve from the previous one.
So to predict the zones, you have to actually go through the zones pretty much. So the machine has got to tell you where these zones are. So the exercise will take you zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, and try and get you into the end of zone 5.
Yeah, so the zones come afterwards. What we measure is we measure where these thresholds are. So zone 2 is basically more or less where that first lower threshold is. Zone 4 marks round about that zone, that higher threshold number. So what we measure is where do these thresholds kick in by certain changes in the breathing metrics while you're wearing this mask. And then afterwards, if we know where these thresholds are, we derive the zones from those numbers. Yeah.
But obviously with the intervals, you up to the next resistance or speed or whatever every 3 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute, every minute.
1 minute for general people, but it depends on the protocol that we use, but any 1 to 2 minute intervals. That's the protocol we use for the testing that we do.
So obviously some people will take a little bit longer getting to the first.
Yeah, it depends on how long they can sustain the intensity. Yeah. So we like the shorter ones to get those increments. That gives us
you get quicker to the max if you use the shorter intervals.
The benefit of the shorter intervals is there's a delayed fatigue, or the reduced risk of fatigue stopping the test instead of actually getting to the right numbers. The more fitter people will do longer numbers, because we want the numbers to stabilize before we go to the next one as well. Yeah. When you add something like lactate, your
need a little bit longer.
It's going to be 3 to 4 minutes. Yes. 3 to 4 minutes, I would say. And the protocols differ, but the ones that we use for the populations that we see is we like the shorter intervals. That is graded, and we usually try and get to about 8 to 12 of these increases. As we try to get to VO2 max, 8 to 12, 8 to 15 of these levels. Yeah.
And once you get these levels, you can then say to someone to move your VO2 max in the right direction, meaning getting it higher. This is what you suggest as a running coach going forward, or give it to a cycling coach, or do you do the cycling as well? Or how do you move then? Because you giving us the number is quite nice. We use that VO2 max as a proxy for longevity, but for you as a coach, how do you use that number?
Yeah, so for my runners, what we do is I want to get the runners, the I coach that I test myself is to get the zones right. And so what I do is I'll do a test every few months to have a look at the numbers to derive that. Then we can actually also see on the training app that I use is in the runs after the test to see how does it correlate nicely to the feedback that the runner gives, but also to just have a look in terms of where they are in their race preparedness. Is a certain pace a realistic goal to train for the marathon in 4 months or in 6 months time at this stage, or do we need to improve it? For example, if they want to run a marathon in a certain amount of time and we see, but this pace falls above that higher threshold, it's not a realistic goal. So then we can start training and see what's set our goals and also set our targets a bit better. But also a couple of fun info that we get out of that as well is the running economy. We can also measure, because you're actually measuring how much oxygen consuming to run at a certain speed. So that helps me also to make training decisions. What training block should we do now? So very efficient running at high intensity paces, not so efficient at low intensity paces. So maybe a little bit more long runs at certain heart rates just to improve that, or vice versa. And then, but yeah, so for people that I don't coach, we make training recommendations, and the devil's usually in the detail. It's not like this is your numbers, this is the things that we need to improve, but the profile we get from the numbers from the test just helps us tailor the decisions that you have to, the decisions or the recommendations in training for the next few months. So basically, it comes down to two things: is get the right intensities to train at, get the right the training zones, and also set a little bit more specific training goals for the next, let's say, 12 to 16 weeks, for example. Yeah, so this is what we need to focus on. So we need a bigger engine, so we have to do more VO2 max stuff, or we need to, VO2 max is quite big, but your the aerobic threshold is sitting at a slower pace than what we wanted, so we have to work a little more on that. Or your
and then you prescribe interval type running, or how does that work?
So we give a guideline. So we give like a 12-week, like, so for your hard run or cycle, once, twice a week, you do these drills to see as a guideline. For the runners, I can provide a little bit more nuanced, but the cyclists, usually it's beneficial if they work with a cycling coach. Then we can give the data to the coach, and the coach can work around that and plan accordingly. Yeah. So it's a nice detail to tailor the plan going forward. It's basically like a snapshot of where are we now, and what's a good next step to take.
And I think that's actually why we're sitting here, because you want the number, we want the number, and we use it for a little bit different reasons. We use it as a proxy for the health, but we normally have a first round of trying to sort out the system before we actually say, okay, but we really think VO2 max is now the next step, whereas your VO2 max is more a tool to tailor exercise. And yeah, it's quite interesting. And I mean, this whole zone 2 has probably been blown out of proportion a little bit, or zone 2, but it is quite nice how you guys use VO2 max testing to actually say, okay, but this is exactly where you should be training. And yeah.
In general, with your athletes, how often do you retest?
I do. Certain runners that I coach, we try and do like not more than, it's not beneficial to do it more than 8 weeks apart. So we try, I think ideal is like, let's say 8 to 16 weeks, let's say 12 weeks, I think is usually a good number to get there. And it depends on where we are, what we're training for as well. So beginning of the training block and halfway through a training block, so we can make decisions. Yeah. To beginning of the training block to see, okay, what does the training numbers look like, and then halfway through the training block to see are the needles moving in the right direction. That's what we try and do. Yeah.
But I think it's I mean the numbers, especially a lot of people they come in, they can see us because they want to make a change, and then they decide to do some other marathon. It might not be the Comrades, it might be something shorter. But I think to have those numbers available to guide them to say, listen, but you should keep in this zone, not to bonk, and then actually finish the race feeling okay. I think that is actually a very important thing to do.
Yeah. So I have a case now of one example I thought now is we're preparing for a marathon after injury. And we had a certain race target, so the injury we got under control, and then we actually tested it to see where our numbers are, and see, okay, but this is a more realistic race goal to have, and we determine the training zones there, and we see, so we do what I call closer to the race, we do these race pace training runs, and the testing actually helped with that, but her feedback on those runs actually makes us nuance that decisions further. So metabolically, that is in theory a good target race pace to have, but she says she doesn't feel comfortable at that pace now. She can sustain it. And what we can derive from that is, instead of, if we didn't test it and we know this is where this pace lies in this spectrum, we would have said, oh yeah, we were training too hard. We would say, we just need more time to develop that. I think the race that we're training for is too soon for this target race pace. So we adjust it, and then we actually stay in that. So the race pace we're trying to train at is in zone 3, and the one that we picked is in the middle of zone 3. So we actually decided we changed our strategy, and we're going to stay in zone 3, but at a little closer to the slower end of it as well, and that's going to be our target race pace. So that's a good thing, where the nuance from having the numbers is quite accurate. If we had it from the equations, then yeah, a lot of doubt would have gone in, and there's a subjectivity that comes into the decision making for preparing for this.
Yeah, I think what everyone should realize is you do have a number. If it's not been tested, there is a number for you. So you're gonna get on the treadmill or the bike, and you will get a number. And that's the nice thing, is if you haven't had a VO2 max test before, as you said, it can be very hard, but it doesn't have to be very hard. So I think more people should have the test to at least know where they are, as you say, on this spectrum, and say, but I can get a lot better. And maybe the training that is prescribed after the test is actually not that hard, that you can actually get fitter with having more numbers. So it is important to have that number.
And I'd like to have also, after the test as well, I try to follow up and have a discussion over the phone, and just to explain what the numbers mean, and where just displaying the little details, and say, okay, but this is actually where we think your threshold is, but you've been training with that, and you feel that with that, it actually feels quite hard. And say, okay, but let's make sense of that as well. If the metabolic numbers show this is where it is, then maybe some strength training is maybe not a bad idea, because maybe the limiting factor is not the fitness, but the conditioning of the legs. So again, we can make decisions on that. Because a lot of times sometimes we do get that. They get the numbers and say, these numbers don't feel like, in comparison to what I have been doing, and they say, okay, but let's understand why that is. And then we say, but actually it's maybe not the limiting factor in something like running is a metabolic thing. It's more a running conditioning, on the running conditioning side of things, or so something else. And what I do with my runners, then I do like follow up running gait analysis, where we test the running biomechanics at different paces. We do strength testing and so forth, to get a profile of, see, is there a limiting factor somewhere else that maybe causing this confusion. A lot of times we do see that, and then we can put some nuance to it, and then yeah.
And what age can you start with that? Maybe for the parents out there that's thinking they've got to run a kid of 12. Can you do it at 12? Can you do this type of thing at 12? Or do you wait till you're 18? Or where do you suggest, maybe for the high school kid? Does VO2 max come into that? No. Gait analysis, maybe yes, or
yeah, the VO2 max actually is a good question. I don't see a lot of kids. That's the thing. So I'm not for that testing as well. So I'm not specifically sure into what age is that perfect to start slotting, getting that out. My assumption would be after most of development, like more like development, so later ages. Gait analysis on I would say definitely high school level, not necessarily on up below 12 years old, I would say, because there's a lot of development happening, say from 12, but it's mostly when I think what later teens would be more beneficial, when they're doing certain running specific things as well. But you kids under 12 just still developing skills, and that includes running as well. They just need to run and do a variety of sports as well, and just get do stuff that challenges agility and strength and speed and power and stuff like that. They will form. Obviously, when they are very noticeable biomechanical deficits, that's a different story. But for a general runner that's doing cross country and playing hockey and playing chess as well, usually they just need to stay active as well. So
It's quite refreshing. Like, because a lot of kids get pressed into a lot of things now, but as you say, just let kids be kids.
Yeah, that's a good podcast to have as well, because that's a deep mind to go into. But yeah, so yeah, let's let kids be kids as well. It's usually later teens than these as specialization becomes more valuable, which is a lot later than I think a lot of people in South Africa think it is, then these testing starts becoming more and more relevant. But that's at later ages that we usually do. Yeah.
Excellent. So do your VO2 max testing, then to all the people that think they don't have time for exercising, is that then at least if you know at which zones to exercise, you won't be wasting time. You'll get to your levels quicker that you want to be at.
Yeah, and I think what I learned today is, like, everyone's got a number, and I think the test is not that difficult, and it's actually quite a cheap-ish test if you think about blood tests and stuff. It's actually not that expensive, and just get on a treadmill, get on a bike, and then you actually get a lot of info from that session. So yeah, they book with Hannes, or book with a biokineticist at Sports Science or Stellenbosch or wherever, and you will get a lot of info about yourself from that session.
You get info about your lungs, your heart, your blood, your muscles, all in one. And if there's a problem, then we can go dive deeper.
Thank you, Hannes. Thank you for going into that. Always keep learning.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Disclaimer. This podcast is not intended as a substitute for the advice of your healthcare provider. No doctor-patient relationship has been formed through this podcast. The content here is for information purposes only.